Thanks much again for organizing, and thanks everybody for being here for the last talk. Today I'm going to discuss this paper joined with Caspar Goodrich and Paul Miaus about hypothesis testing, and we recently changed the title to a model of hypothesis testing. Okay, let me start from the motivation, and we have seen some of these already yesterday. And when we think about multiple hypothesis testing, we typically think about three different dimensions. One dimension is testing the effect of a single treatment on multiple subgroups, for instance, the older and the younger individuals. Another dimension is testing the effect of multiple treatments. And the third dimension is testing the effect on multiple outcomes. And there is some intuition that if we want to test for many hypotheses, then we would like to adjust inference accordingly. So if we have 100 tests, then maybe the probability of at least one post rejection is going to be approximately to 1 once these tests are independent. So the idea behind the multiple hypothesis testing that we do see in practice is that given a notion of compound error, now I'm going to give you an algorithm that can control that. So a typical example is, for instance, if I want to control family-wise error rate, for which there exists many algorithms, and this really means that I want to control the probability of at least one false rejection. But I can also think about other methods, other notion of compound error that I want. So one example is false discovery rate, which is the expected proportion of false rejection over the overall rejection. And another approach that people use in practice is indexing. So indexing, what this means is that I'm going to take many outcomes that I have, I'm going to collapse this outcome into a single measure, and now I solve the problem of multiple hypothesis testing because now I only test one hypothesis on a single outcome, which is this index. So let's step back a little bit and think about multiple hypothesis testing in two different contexts. The first context is FDA approval, when, for instance, we want the approval of the drug for multiple subgroups. Now, in this context, we can think about two different phases of analysis of our data. So the first phase is an exploratory phase. So in the exploratory phase, what happens is that the analyst does not need to pre-specify which subgroups are the most interested, just reporting their analysis treatment effect heterogeneity across different subgroups. Now, because the analyst did not pre-specify the subgroups, now the findings are not going to be binding in terms of decision-making. It's not that I'm going to approve your drug for the female instead of male individuals just because in this exploratory phase you found a treatment effect heterogeneity. However, if I do find some heterogeneity, then I may want afterwards to pre-specify on which subgroups I want to test the drug and use these as my endpoint subgroups. So maybe I'm interested in testing the drug on males and females separately because I do believe that there is treatment effect heterogeneity. And so if for one of these subgroups I do receive approval, then I can sell the drug for these subgroups. And so here is just a quote from these not binding guides, but is like this guide from FDA, where they recommend to control family-wise error rate across the different tests. Now, always, let's keep in mind, and we've seen this multiple times throughout this conference, that running experiments is typically very costly, but also assessments are then difficult to make. And here I'm reporting this quote that we also discussed briefly yesterday, where in this clinical trial, there was some observed heterogeneity across two different subgroups, and two different regulatory agencies decided to approve the drugs in different ways. So one regulatory agency decided to approve the drug for the entire population, and the other one instead only for one of the two subgroups. So there is also some heterogeneity in terms of how do we intend decision-making for this type of analysis. Now, a different context, which may also be of interest, slightly less related to what I'm going to discuss today, but we're going to then return to this towards the end of the talk, is the context of publishing in economics, and so setting editorial standards in economics. And again, this is something that we've seen last time, just to recap, for which we do see heterogeneity in the number of papers, which are just infinite because of multiple hypothesis testing, and we do see trends as well. So if we just focus our attention on the experimental paper, the share of papers adjusting inference because of multiplicity goes from 0% to 40%. And consider that basically all of this paper has some form of multiplicity. And now if we look within the paper adjusting inference because we have multiple tests, now we do see heterogeneity in the notion of compound error that they control, either family-wise error rate or false discovery rate, and some paper also use indexing or combination of these. Yeah.
So I wondered to what extent people actually adjust which of those they use in order to just meet this threshold. That's definitely something that's happened with Dr. Applied courses where we can't like reject 5% of the family-wise error rate, but if you switch to false discovery rate, we're okay. So that's
so that definitely can happen in practice. I've also talked with editors who told me, well, you know, sometimes we do see that the effect is going to be significant with discovery rate control. It seems clear that it's not going to be significant with family-wise error rate control, but we don't want to kill the result, so we don't ask for that. So that definitely can also happen in practice, right?
That's a meta multiple comparisons.
It's anyhow. So moving away from the recap from yesterday, let me just discuss what I'm going to present today. And today I'm going to present a paper which studies when and how we would like to adjust inference because of multiple hypotheses. And we're going to try to relate the problem to the economics of the environment. So when I think about the economics of the environment, I think about what's the nature of multiplicity. Maybe I have multiple subgroups. Maybe I study the effect of multiple treatments. Maybe I have multiple outcomes. What are the research costs associated with testing more hypotheses? And what are the policy implications that I want to think of when I test? So to do so, we need to take into account the researcher incentives. And we're going to do this by building a model which is based on three core ideas. The first idea is that research is a public good, and so it's gonna whatever you find in your experiment may influence decision making. So if the drug company is gonna find that the drug is effective, then this is gonna generate some policy implications. Now, on the other hand, research costs are borne privately by the researcher, and so the researcher will face a decision on whether to run the experiment in the first place or not, based on the approval prospects. Now, the third is that there is a regulator, and we can think again about FDA, who can ex ante enforce hypothesis testing. So the goal of this paper is going to be to characterize the protocol that maximizes the worst case welfare. And when I think about worst case welfare, it's going to be worst case over the set of treatment effects that different policy implementation may generate by balancing two goals. So on one side, I don't want to generate bad policy guidance in a worst case sense. But on the other side, I don't want to disincentivize too much experimentation. And I'm going to formalize this in the objective function. Now, yesterday I briefly introduced this paper by Davide of 2006, which in the single hypothesis setting may justify single hypothesis testing. This really start from the premise that justifying hypothesis testing in the first place is very difficult. So we want to think about this in a strategic environment where we have budgets. So as I mentioned before, to think about hypothesis testing, we take a stand of a decision-making perspective where each hypothesis corresponds to a given decision. And this is clear when we have multiple treatments or multiple subgroups. So if I'm going to test the effect of a drug on a given subgroup, now this is going to have a policy implication of whether the drug is approved or not approved for that particular subgroup. So each test corresponds to one decision. But this becomes a little bit blurry once I start thinking about multiple outcomes. Because now once I have multiple outcomes, I only have one single decision in principle, but I have multiple objectives that I face. And so we're going to try to think of how we can incorporate the notion of multiple outcomes and how this relates to multiple hypotheses. So to do so, we're going to think about two different frameworks for multiple outcomes, where on one side, we first think about setting where I have a single policy decision to make and many objectives. And on the other side, we think about multiple outcomes as informing an heterogeneous audience which cares about different objectives. Okay. So throughout the talk, I'm gonna first discuss multiple treatments, and then I'm gonna discuss multiple outcomes when relevant distinction are how research costs are gonna influence decisions, but also how we think about multiple outcomes for informing decision making.
But with the heterogeneous audience, then you again think of like making multiple decisions at the end of the day.
This is our argument. So at the moment we're going to introduce an heterogeneous audience, then we can relate the problem again to testing problem, because now there's going to be many decision, one for each decision.
Could you think of one decision maker with incomplete purposes?
So we're going to look at case with a single decision maker. In that case, the way we think about multiple outcomes is just that each outcome, each expected value, expected effect on the outcome is going to characterize a part of the utility function. So the utility function of the single policymaker is just going to be given by the determinations of the effect on each of
Right, but for the heterogeneous audience part, could you think about just one person with incomplete purposes maybe?
Yeah, the way we think about the heterogeneous people is really the many people each care about one different outcome, but you can equivalently think about having one person and this person will care about one outcome, which we don't know which. I think there is like a timing, like after a while that you don't use it, then okay. Okay, so there is a large literature. But some of you have worked, of course, in this space. So definitely we connect to the literature and economic analysis of optimal statistical approaches, and the difference with respect to this literature is that we focus on multiple hypothesis testing, whereas here the problem is mostly about single hypothesis testing. We connect to the literature on scientific communication, and again, the main distinction from this literature is about focus on multiple hypothesis testing, and the connection here is mostly to think about multiple outcomes from this heterogeneous audience perspective, so it's going to be for the second part of the paper. We connect more broadly to the work on decision theory and hypothesis testing, which mostly look at problems as a game against nature. And the main distinction with respect to this literature is that we're going to think about this as in strategic environment, where there are two agents, and one agent is private information and private incentive, so mostly like as a principal agent problem. And finally, there is a large literature on statistical methods for multiple hypothesis testing correction, which provide methods to correct a given notion of compound error. Here we're gonna take a step back and just think of when and which type of notion we want to consider based on economics. Okay, so let's start from the multiple treatments, and so we can think about multiple treatments either as multiple treatments or having studying the effect of multiple subgroups. So the two problems are equivalent. So we have a few players, actually two. The first is the researcher. So there's going to be one researcher who decides whether to run a pre-specified experiment with capital J techniques. We keep things super simple. So there is just binary decision to make, either a random experiment, and this experiment. Now, if the researcher runs the experiment, she's going to draw this vector from this distribution f of theta. But again, to keep things simple, just let's think about theta to be a vector parameter of dimension j, where each denoted the effect of a given intervention. Now, the researcher will then report a vector of discovery, again of dimension j, r of x, and each entry is binary, and it's going to tell us whether we want to implement the policy or we don't want to implement the policy. So going back to Max's point yesterday of how to think about communicating statistics, already here we're going to make a restriction on basically the communication of our scientific discoveries, because we're going to assume that when the researcher run the experiment, she only can report whether we want to implement the policy or not, so she's not going to report anything else. So somehow the policymaker is naive, can only incorporate binary bits.
It's almost like it's delegating the decision to the researcher.
Yeah. Now there is a social planner who's going to choose the optimal testing protocol, R star, where the goal in mind is to maximize worst case welfare. I'm going to be precise what I mean by that. And so we can think about this as the FDA approval agency in our example. Now, given the test
Sorry, but
yeah.
I guess just connecting this back to what I was talking about yesterday. So I guess here's no researcher expertise that we really care about that we would want to leverage in the choice of our star. Because I mean that was our argument that the whole point of having a pre-analysis plan is that there is this expertise.
So the researcher will have private knowledge about the vector parameters.
But that our star is nonetheless chosen by.
It's gonna be chosen by the researcher.
So there's no pre-registration which would allow us to partially delegate that.
So we're gonna assume that the experiment is pre-registered in the sense that the capital J treatment and the distribution of data is not manipulated once observed the data. So there is pre-registration in that sense, but there's no delegation the way you're thinking.
Like where to direct power, for instance, or which treatment, which outcomes look at it, so on. Which is
That's exactly right. So basically what we're gonna say, we're gonna say, okay, you as a researcher, so we are gonna we can characterize the optimal R star, or we can characterize the space of optimal R, and then let the researcher pick from that space. That's also possible, if that's your concern. So in case in which the researcher has some private information about data, and then say, okay, maybe I want large power in this particular direction, then maybe I can only give you a space of R, and then you as a researcher pick space. Okay. Policy implementation. So given our function R of X, then I'm going to define a welfare effect on a set of stakeholders as the dot product between theta and R of X. So if we think about testing it at multiple subgroups, this is really the effect on each subgroups times the decision to make, assuming subgroups have homogeneous size. So for now, I'm going to assume that there are no spillovers between subgroups or no interaction, and there's going to be lots of extension that we've added to this paper, like dependency is, I think, twice as long as the main text almost. So I'm going to discuss some of that. So here is a simple example. We have some outcome of interest Y. This outcome of interest may depend on treatment effect, which are binary, and I denote them as B. And then I have some treatment, some treatment which are binary, and then I have some treatment effect which are theta. And my X may be just the least square estimate from the regression. So I may have some theta X, which is distributed as a Gaussian with mean data and variance. And one example of testing protocol is just standard t-test, where I just look at my estimated effect and then I scale by the standard error.
Here is also no scope for p-hacking.
No, so this is why pre-registration in this phase is important, because once I pre-commit to run the experiment, then I'm gonna truthfully report whatever is experiment. There's no PR. So this is why we think that this model really applies to pre-registered experiments. So we're not thinking about observational studies in this sense. Okay, so let me think about the first stage, where the social planner has to think about the optimal R star or the class of R star. So the social planner does not know theta, the parameter of interest, and she's gonna choose R to maximize the worst case welfare. And so let me denote the R of theta to be the welfare. And what I'm gonna do is that I'm gonna look at the worst case over the parameter space theta. And now I'm gonna add to the utility of the social planner a subjective utility component. And the subjective utility is going to depend on a parameter lambda, and this lambda can take any value, and later we will, it's going to depend on some prior that the social planner has over theta, and then it's going to depend on whether the researcher has run the experiment. So somehow this component is going to capture the value of running the experiment in the first place. Okay. So if the researcher runs the experiment, now welfare is going to be just the dot product of the parameter times the decision integrated over the distribution of my axis, and then this ER of theta is going to be equal to 1 in the sense that I'm going to just receive some positive value lambda for the researcher to run the experiment. If the researcher does not run the experiment, then this is just equal to 0. So stage 2, the researcher who knows theta, so the researcher has private information, And knowing theta can be relaxed to think that the researcher has a prior over the parameter, and then you're gonna be worst case over the prior of the researcher. She's gonna benefit, so she's gonna have a private utility. And now we're gonna model this utility by saying, well, there is a cost of running the experiment, which maybe depend on the number of times C of J. But then there are also some profits that the researcher can make. And so we're gonna say that the utility of the researcher is gonna scale linearly in the number of discoveries. So going back to the example of multiple subgroups, each of equal size, we're really saying that there is a profit that I make by selling to each subgroup. And so this cost function is going to be the cost of running the experiment divided by the profit of selling to each subgroup.
So yeah, I'm really confused about notation. The ER is theta here. Why is it not just 0, 1? Assumptions. Why do you put
Sorry?
Like, if, like what you are putting the second equation is that ER is either 0 or 1.
Mm-hmm. So this the expected value. So this the probability that I rejected. Yeah, what?
The one before, right? You basically have ER theta is 1 if you experiment, and 0 if you don't.
Right.
But then why do you have the integral up there? Just trying to understand.
Because the decision of the researcher may depend on theta. So ER of theta is going to be the choice of the researcher whether the researcher runs the experiment or not. And so the decision of the researcher running the experiment may depend on private information of the researcher.
I see.
And pi is the researcher's prior.
No, pi is the subjective prior of the researcher plan.
Oh.
Yeah. So if you just forget about this component, we're going to consider a case where lambda is greater than 0, lambda is equal to 0. This is just max min problem. Now we're going to add this component, and I'm going to return to a discussion around what we want to value the scientific discoveries. Why we want to value experimentation.
So
yeah.
What justifies this form of the utility function?
We're basically saying we have an ambiguity aversion component.
Yeah.
So this is basically a no harm principle, sure, and a subjective. So this in the spirit, for instance, of Banerjee et al. Paper. You find version of these typically with VR of theta here instead of VR of theta. But what we're saying is that okay, the social planner is gonna may get some utility from experimentation under some subjective prior, and then there's ambiguity aversion.
It just looks a little bit strange not to use them. If you're ambiguity averse, why not be ambiguity averse about the whole thing? Or if you're a Bayesian, why not be a Bayesian about the whole thing?
Yeah, but you do find this structure of utility function in the literature most of the times. Similar structure like this. So one example is Banerjee et al. Paper.
I mean, the people have had all kinds of things.
Yeah, exactly. But you can.
It sounds good.
So what if you are just maximum? If you just want the maximum solution, and pick lambda. We're gonna discuss the characterization of the optimal. If you say you also care about experimentation, then lambda is gonna be better. And so we think that you may care about experimentation because you may also have that.
I was just wondering if you can justify it with some sort of variational preferences or something of the sort.
I'm gonna return to so we consider also other characterization of optimal objective function. I'm gonna return to discussion. Okay, so we have a social planner, for instance, FDA. So ambiguity aversion relates to this Hippocratic notion of non-washer, primum non-washer. A utility from experimentation comes from the fact that most of clinical trials sometimes rely on previous studies. So yeah, I'm just quoting Lewis' words before.
Sorry,
yeah.
So you're making a lot of steps here that have to follow. But like I would have thought of the don't do no harm thing as being about regret, say, right? Like you don't want to treat people, but the treatment effect is negative or something like that, as opposed to like thinking about worst case scenarios. But those are like two conceptually separate things.
Yeah. So here we are thinking about this. Okay, so you're making the point that this ambiguity aversion component does not is not justified from a do no harm.
I mean, it can be justified, but for separate reasons. I would say, like, I would think of the do no harm as saying never treat if the treatment effect is negative, which is a violation of consequentialism, but
okay,
that's kind of separate.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks. Okay. Here we are thinking about max mean because it's basically like I care about the worst case scenario what to be. Because of ambiguity aversion. But yeah, thanks for this comment. So probably. Okay, then we think about the researcher who is a firm producing drugs.
Sorry, I'm just like slow here, but
yeah,
the utility from experimentation part, then there is some kind of implicit argument that the information might be used for different purposes.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
But you think the information content is independent of outcomes, it really depends on whether or not the experiment is conducted.
Yeah, so we think about this component. So you can model this component in different ways because you can actually be structural, say, okay, how would information from this experiment then affect future experiments? So maybe it may affect welfare in future experiment by making new discovery, things like that. Then we think about this almost like a reduced form type expression in which we say, okay, we only care about this component because runs the experiment. It's just a simplification.
I mean, reduced form is fine, but I guess it would still be weird if it doesn't depend on theta.
Sorry?
It would still be strange if it did not depend on theta, which is.
So you would like the second component itself to depend on theta as well.
Right, for you, it only depends on whether you run the experiment or not.
That's right.
But if I think about what's the value of the experiment, that is if the treatment effect is 0, it doesn't really matter what anybody does down the road. It would be very different than if I don't want treatment is really horrible.
For sure. So here we're really thinking, we're mostly abstracting from the value of theta because we're thinking, okay, maybe running the experiment can produce knowledge. We don't know the type of knowledge that this experiment is going to generate, so we just give value for the fact that you run the experiment or you don't run the experiment. So maybe there are other populations that we don't know ex ante, and this can be discovered through an exploratory phase, and so we just give values to run the experiment itself. But you're right, in principle, you can let this depend.
Just one last thing. Why do the analysts or researchers, why do they only care if they recommend a rejection, an adoption, and it gets adopted? Why don't they get utility if they recommend not to adopt and it doesn't get adopted?
Here, so I'm a drug company, so I want to test whether the drug is effective. And if the drug gets adopted, then I'm going to sell the drug. If the drug does not get adopted, I'm going to sell it. So don't make it complicated. Okay, so this is exactly this point of the researcher. So the researcher is coming from. So some extensions, so we can think about setting where we have a subpopulation which has varying size. So for instance, there is heterogeneity in this sum based on some weight component. We can think about the researcher having a prior, in which case we interpret our result as worst case over the prior of the researcher. We have a formal extension. We can also think about setting where the researcher endogenously is going to choose which treatment to test and also J before but then specifying. And so also here the results are going to be robust. So the first result is when lambda is equal to 0. So we only care about the max mean objective. And in this case, we provide an if and only if characterization of the class of max mean optimal solution standard. And so this if and only if characterization is very simple. It's basically saying that the welfare needs to be weakly positive, which can be written as saying that the utility of the researcher needs to be negative for any theta in some parameter space, and then in the remaining component of the parameter space, we need positive utility. So if we want to visualize these in a two-dimensional framework, suppose that we have theta 1 and theta 2, now theta 0 define the parameter space for which both parameters are negative. And so what we are saying is that the utility of the researcher whenever both parameters are negative needs to be negative. So the first condition provides us with a notion of error control. for which we want to say, for instance, that the sum of the probability that I reject the first and the second hypothesis is less or equal than the cost of running the experiment for any theta in this theta 0, which is defined in the hypothesis testing literature as the global space. So let's think about this condition. Suppose that now we're going to test more and more hypotheses. Now what's going to happen is that in the left-hand side, we're going to sum more and more probabilities. And so the way the cost is going to scale with the number of hypotheses may motivate different type of adjustments. So if the cost is constant in the number of hypotheses that I want to test, now I'm going to have more and more tests, but then this threshold is going to remain invariant. And so cost complementarities are going to drive the type of adjustment. This is what I just discussed.
Because of the participation constraint.
Right, because of the individual rationalities. Okay, so here to your question. So far we have basically provided a formalization of the max-min solution. So now let's consider about how we can select within this class of max-min solution. And the main issue is that the class of max-min solution is very large. So I'm going to give you one example of max-min optimal solution, which is going to be always 0, so you never reject any null hypothesis, so this is gonna be max-min optimal, but in some sense it's not something that we would like to select from this class. And so the question becomes, okay, how can I find a refinement of this class of max-min optimal solution? So one way to do so is to say, well, maybe I can find a max-min optimal solution which is gonna be uniformly most powerful for any value of the parameter. Unfortunately, this does not exist, so there's no uniformly most powerful test in this multiple hypothesis testing framework. So we cannot have a unique consensus on which max-min solution we want. So this is where then we started thinking, okay, maybe what we want to value is the value of scientific research in the first place. So I don't want to discourage research when I think that the parameter is going to take positive values. Right.
Maximum.
Yeah.
The maximum here is that you have a default utility for each component of 0, I guess. Right. I'm just trying to understand where does the maximum load relative to say a maximum regrets, which again would be the no harm version of it.
Right. So max-min regret. How would you model max-min regret here? One way to say is that you say I'm gonna take j of x to be positive whenever theta is positive. And then I'm going to compare the solution to the max-min regret. But then we know from Telenor 2012 that max-min regret hardly justify standard hypothesis testing adjustment unless we look then at a symmetric max-min regret with degree of asymmetry of 100. So we didn't want to take that. And so what we say, okay, let's first look at max-min solutions. And
max-min then always just never treat.
Okay, so we got a full characterization of the max-min solution, and one solution is always 0. But you have a full class of possible solutions. So now we would like to refine the class of max-min solution, so to exclude these which are intuitively dominated. And so one way to do so is to say, well, maybe I'm going to look for something which is uniformly most powerful across all the values of theta, but such a rule does not exist because we have theta that can take values in mixed sort.
But I mean, if the thetas are negative, the minimum is always less than 0 for any rule that has some probability of rejecting, right? So why would 0 not be the unique maximum?
No, it's not the unique maximum.
So that's
I'm gonna give you another example of max-min solution.
That has uniformly, that has
yes.
its utility uniformly bounded below 0.
In the next slide.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, but that's because you assume that the researchers know the theta,
yeah,
and they're only going to test the ones where the theta are positive.
Yeah, the researcher knows theta.
Right.
Or we're gonna look at worst case prior with theta.
So if the researchers didn't know theta, that would not be true.
So if the researcher didn't know theta, then you should model the prior over theta. So
but anytime there's some uncertainty over theta.
So if the researcher is worst case over theta, then the researcher will never run the experiment itself. So the researcher has information about data. And so the assumption is that the researcher has a prior data. And then either the researcher knows that exactly, or we're going to be maximum.
Right, but I guess what my intuition would be, which might be wrong,
Yeah.
is that the max-min would be uniquely the worrying never treat solution, unless the researcher has perfect information over theta.
No. If the researcher has a prior over theta, and then I'm worst case over the prior of the researcher, then I'm gonna record the same solution that I'm gonna give you. So, yeah. I'm gonna need some distribution assumption. So yeah. Okay, so we got the class of max min optimal solution, and so now we need a refinement. And so this is somehow, if you want, you can think in some sense is a little bit ad hoc, because we're going to impose these the second component in our utility function that essentially models value of scientific research. And so what we're going to say, okay, so one way to think about the refinement of this class of max min protocol is to say, suppose that we're going to restrict pi, so the subjective prior, to be in a class of prior with support over the positive order bounding. So we're going to say, okay, let's just take pi, this pi to be positive over the order taking value from 0, 1. Now, the optimal solution to this objective problem is going to be a solution which is max min optimal. So this is exactly what we've seen before, and so this max min optimality is going to provide a notion of size control in our framework. But then at the same time, it also requires that the utility of the research is weakly positive for any data in this alternative parameter space where all treatment are positive. And this is a notion of a bias test. So the optimal solution that now we characterize is a solution which in some sense needs to provide size control, but also needs some biasness. And this rules out the boring solution always 0. And so this is what we're saying. We're saying, okay, now this optimal solution for any value of lambda and for any pi in this space is going to be a solution which is going to be max min optimal. So one condition will be that the utility of the researcher is weakly negative on this overtant, but on the other hand, if we take the prior to be on the positive overtant, now we're going to require that the utility of researcher is weakly positive over this other.
Can I just ask you to be slow from me?
Okay.
So if you take lambda equals 0, cap j equal to 1,
Mm-hmm.
so the simplest case, just one hypothesis, no benefit of experimentation.
Lambda equals 0.
And cap j equal 1, so just one
Okay.
hypothesis.
Yeah.
Right, then my utility is really just, I guess, decision times theta.
Yeah.
Right, so the expectation of that is the probability of rejecting times theta, which is going to be negative for negative theta anytime that the probability of a decision 1 is bigger than 0.
Okay.
Right, so in particular, then any decision rule that has a probability bigger than 0 of rejecting is going to have a negative worst case utility.
Sorry?
Any decision rule that has a positive probability of rejecting the null is going to have a negative worst case utility, expected utility.
That's right.
Whereas the decision rule that never rejects has worst case utility 0.
Yeah.
So in terms of worst case utility, the one that never rejects is always dominating the one that has some probability of rejecting.
So if we think about a decision rule, so let me see if I'm getting wrong here. So suppose that I look at a decision rule R star, which is going to say beta R of theta is exactly equal to 0. Now, in this case, what's going to happen is that when theta is in the negative sign, the researcher will not run any experiment. I'm assuming a tie-breaking rule, which at 0 the researcher does the best.
Okay, so this is again in the world where the researcher knows theta,
right?
And then the rule just selects you to all.
So exactly, because it's gonna basically extract information. So the idea is that there is almost like extracting information from the research.
Right, but what now if the researcher has some uncertainty over theta?
Yeah.
Then again, there's a worst case where we'll get a negative expected utility.
Because you say, okay, the researcher is gonna know. So, okay, so that's important. So when we look at the worst case over the researcher prior, what we're gonna do is that we're gonna integrate the welfare over the prior itself.
Sure.
So the way you're thinking is that you're saying, okay, if I look at the researcher, which has a worst case prior, I still have a utility function which takes this form mean over theta of the other, right? But the way we're thinking about the prior of the researcher is where we integrate this utility over pi of theta, where pi is the prior of the researcher itself. It's almost like prior is kind of correctly specified.
That's kind of like a least favorable prior, but
Right, but we integrate the welfare over the prior itself. So so this is something that also Davide does, for example, in this paper. And so in that case, you can also allow for the researcher having a prior over the parameters data.
Okay.
So that's what's happening. Because if instead you don't integrate over the prior, then you're right. Because in a worst case scenario, you can just make yours worse off as you want. Because what I can say, well, maybe the researcher has a prior that the parameter that is positive, but then the true parameter is negative, and then I'm just making you worse off. And then what we do is that we're going to integrate over the prior also for the work.
and so basically, okay,
See?
Yeah.
So this is the trick. So you're right that if I am worst case over the prior of the researcher, but I'm also worst case over theta, then yes, then you're. But the moment I integrate over the prior of the researcher, quote unquote, I'm basically saying this prior is correct. Yeah.
Coming back to what you spoke earlier, is like I kind of didn't understand why your max over the theta space, but with respect to the researcher, you are Bayesian since you do.
Sorry?
Why is that you are max over the theta space, but you still integrate with respect to the welfare of the researcher? Why are you Bayesian with respect to welfare of researcher while you are worst case over theta? So like what
Which part you don't understand? You don't understand this part, or you don't understand when I'm referring to the misspecified to the prior of the researcher? Because
so I think my question is trying like to link this comment to Max and Bruno earlier, which is we are avoiding this negative utility precisely because we integrate with respect to the priors in some sense and being Bayesian with respect.
Right, but I don't know the prior. That's exactly right.
But
this is what
I'm still worst case.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I'm basically saying, okay, the researcher has some true, quote unquote, true information about the parameter data, which is encoded in a prior pi.
it's not a way of saying the same thing as you have a common prior, but a private signal of the researcher.
Exactly. It is basically the researcher has a true signal about the parameter data, which I don't know.
Okay.
So this is what it means.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe I should put slides on that. But yeah, thanks. Okay, so then the next question is, does it exist a rule which satisfies this max mean optimality? So
Sorry, I think just
yeah,
conceptually, right, I mean, I think the same is true in other contexts. What you load the worst case on versus what you're averaging over has a lot of bite in terms of the results you get.
100%.
And it's easy to get a bit of a flavor of backward engineering. I guess another example
Sure.
experiment, by randomized experiments, right? Which only happens if you don't minimax conditional the randomization device, but only ex ante.
Sure.
And yeah, so
That's right. Yeah, for sure. I mean, you can definitely come up with different objective functions. So for instance, okay, so moving away from the privacy on which I think we agree, but tell me if you have questions. So another way to think about the objective function is to say we can remove this component here and then think about, for instance, a maximum solution and then start thinking about other refinement criteria. And so this is something that we do in the paper. So in the paper, for instance, we say, okay, we've seen in the literature that some people use this worst case power criteria. So how does our how would the choice of the optimal R change the moment we start looking at this worst case deviation, where we say, well, maybe we have an epsilon deviation from the origin. And what we show is that this epsilon deviation from the origin is gonna provide us with a larger class than the class that we just provide here. So this is almost a refinement also with respect to that notion of power. Another way to think about power is to say, well, maybe I'm gonna weight my objective function over some weights over some prior over the parameter theta, and then I'm gonna try to maximize that. That's another way to do that. And then our comment on that is that you can do it if you know the weights, but if you don't know the weights because of this lack of uniformness power to test, then the solution will always depend on the weights. So in some sense here, we would like to achieve a solution which is independent of the weights themselves and depend the least as possible on the prior time. And so this type of solution is given by a max-min optimal solution, which is unbiased. Is almost like a rationalization.
So that leaves me curious, like again, kind of connecting to what I was talking about yesterday, right? In a way, what you are doing here is like a self-selection into whether you experiment or not. And that's a way of eliciting the private information about theta that the researcher has.
That's right. Which
in our framework that's basically what the pre-analysis plan allows you to do, which you don't really have here because it's the decision maker who picks the R function. Right. As opposed to the choice of R function already including the information about what the... So I'm wondering like if like a supermodel that includes the two, how that would come out and whether there's still any value of the self-selection if you allow for pre-registration.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's outside, I think it's a little bit outside the scope of this paper that we're discussing.
That's perfectly fine. I'm just like wondering.
It's a good question, definitely. It's like, okay, then we incorporate also choice of pre-analysis plans, then maybe we can elicit information. Okay, so then the next question is, does it exist a rule that satisfies this condition? And here what we're gonna do is that we're gonna impose distribution assumption on our X withdrawn from a Gaussian with mean theta and variance sigma, and then we also are gonna impose an homoscedasticity restriction on the variance component. So we basically say that the variance across the different tests and subgroups is the same. And now in this framework, the optimal solution is gonna be a t-test where the threshold will depend on the cost of the experiment. And so the class of max-min solution will require that the threshold is sufficiently larger relative to the cost of the experiment. And if I also want an unbiased test, then the optimal solution is gonna set the threshold to be exactly equal to the size which itself depends on the cost of the test. So what does this mean? Well, this means is that the class of max-min solution will impose a size restriction for which the sum of these probabilities is less or equal than the cost for any theta and theta 0, and then the unbiased solution will impose that this restriction holds with exact value. And the challenge here is really to show that on this mixed orthant you don't achieve negative work. And this is possible through this Gaussianity assumption and homoscedasticity. So let's try to step back and let's try to understand how these relate to process control in general. So now let's consider two different cost functions. One cost function where we only have a fixed cost value alpha and the variable cost equal to 0. And a cost function where there is no fixed cost but only variable cost, and the variable cost scale with a number of treatment terms. Now in the first case, the optimal solution will impose a boundary correction where alpha over j is the best thing to do. And in the second case, there's no need to do any correction whatsoever. And so the main intuition is that cost complementarity should drive the type of multiple hypothesis testing adjustment that we want to impose in practice. So how can we think about size in this framework if we want to implement it somehow in practice? Then one way to do that is to say, well, I know that my adjustment for capital J number of treatment terms is going to be equal, it's going to be proportional to the size for testing a single hypothesis times this component. And this component does not really depend on the level of the cost because I'm rescaling by C1, but it only depends on how C of j over j is scaled with j. So if somehow I can pin down this function, then it doesn't really depend on it. Okay, so some comments. So one is, okay, but what if we don't know the utility of the researcher? Can we think about some robustness guarantees to the misspecified utility? So one way to think about this is to say, well, maybe I know some upper bound on the utility of the researcher. And now if I know some upper bound, I can still guarantee max-min optimality. And if instead I want optimality, given that I impose restriction for this upper bound of the utility, this optimality result with respect to this a more complex objective function which depends on the value of experimentation will still hold, but I will need to restrict the class of priors that I have over the parameter space. And so one idea here is that if we don't really know the cost for running the experiment, maybe we can use some upper bound, which will give us some indication of achieving some form of maximum optimality. And of course, this is gonna somehow make the rule a little bit more conservative. Then we can think about interaction. So one way to think about interaction is to say, well, maybe the utility of the researcher will have some interaction in terms of the number of discovery. For instance, my utility will only depend on the indicator whether at least kappa discovery will be made. So in this case, again, we argue that under some independence assumption of my x's, then the separate t-test is still gonna satisfy some optimality properties. Then you can also think about including interaction in the welfare effects. And in this case, what it turns out to have some optimality properties is a notion of weak family-wise allocated. So going back to the previous point, there are also some questions saying, okay, how do we think about other notion of power that we can incorporate? So for instance, we can think about worst case power where we study epsilon deviation from the null hypothesis, and this is something in the paper, or we can think about weighted average power where we weight our objective function by some weight which depends on the parameter theta. And our argument here is that any solution will always depend on the weights. You can never find a solution which is optimal uniformly across the weights.
Sorry, taking a step back. The only reason everything is not separable here across all the components is because the cost function is not separable. Is that right? So if CJ was linear in J, then everything would just there was no multiple testing, was just many single tests.
Exactly. So this is basically our comment here. Is say, okay, there is a question of saying, okay, but if I run multiple experiments as a researcher, should adjust inference across all the experiments I run throughout my entire life? But as human beings, should we do that? Well, one solution is to say if there are no cost complementarities, these are just independent problems, so there's no need to adjust inference across these. And this is basically coming out from lack of cost.
And really, it's what we mean when we say cost complementarity is self-selection complementarities into running experiments. Right, like if it was given what experiments are run, then
sorry?
If it was just fixed what experiments were run, then all this would matter.
Right. Well, basically, there's no cost. So it's basically how the cost scale in J. So let me move to multiple outcomes. So in the case of multiple outcomes, I'm going to have capital J outcomes, and each outcome is going to be associated with some statistic that I estimate.
Perhaps a question before you include multiple outcomes. I know that your set is very much for the pre-registered setting.
Yeah.
Can you speculate what this means for non-pre-registered settings? Or can you rule out certain things that why it's optimal here, what is not optimal
good question.
In the non-pre-registered? I mean, either experiment and non-pre-registered, or just sort of.
But also, I think you call it pre-registered, but I wouldn't call it pre-registered.
There's no manipulation.
Okay, no manipulation. There's no pre-hacking.
Yes. And I don't have a good sense of what's going to happen when there is pre-hacking, to be honest. So I cannot say what's going to be the optimal solution. I believe that it's going to be quote unquote more conservative than this type of adjustment. So my sense would be, but we don't have formal result on that, is that the type of adjustment that we would like to do is going to be more staged.
So in particular, so that was put up in my hypothesis as well. So no multiple hypothesis adjustment, testing adjustment, that can never be optimal.
I think
it depends again on. I mean,
if the selection is fixed, it's like separate decisions, right? There's no adjustment at all. So nothing to do with PIP.
So what might happen is that size control might be more stringent for each separate test, but this is more stringent because of p-hacking. But I'm not sure there is some adjustment, and so I don't know. To be honest, I don't know. But if people can endogenously choose the number of hypotheses given the data that observe, then I believe that you may always want some form of hypothesis testing, multiple hypothesis testing adjustment. That's just a conjecture, but I don't know if it's.
But I also wouldn't call this setting pre-registered, but I would call it centralized in some sense. Because again, it's not the researcher who's pre-registering something, it's like the decision maker who's pre-registering in a way.
Yeah, and yeah, it
Yeah,
depends. The way I would call it is that the researcher cannot manipulate the statistics.
But the researcher cannot choose anything about the data analysis here. But
And yeah, you cannot choose the design, that's exactly right. So the design is fixed exam.
and the testing function.
Right, but we have an extension where the researcher can choose which treatment to test and can choose the number J, but this is ex ante pre-specified, so before seeing the data. So that's fine. That we do. Any other question? Okay, so suppose that we have capital J outcomes, and each outcome is associated with an estimated effect. So we have, for instance, outcome mod J is equal to some treatment effect, and then we have some by Caroline. And then we have some effect for estimated for each outcome. And now we can think about having an audience of capital J policymaker, and each policymaker is going to have a utility uj of data. And so because we introduced capital J policymakers, now we basically reintroduce an hypothesis testing problem, multiple hypothesis testing problem, because we can think about having one decision for each policy. So let's first consider the case where the number of policymakers equals the number of outcomes, and there is some uncertainty with respect to which policymaker will implement the policy. So the welfare for policymaker J, let's assume is gonna just be the effect on a given outcome. So we basically define each outcome to be the expected value of each outcome is just gonna define the objective of a given policymaker. For instance, I have a Minister of Health which cares about health, Minister of Education which cares about education. So moving a little bit away from the FDA type approval, being a little bit more broadly. And the researcher is gonna report J test, one for each policymaker. And suppose again that the utility of the researcher is going to depend on the number, on the expected number of discoveries that are made minus some cost, which may depend on the number of outcomes that I collected in my study. So now in this framework is exactly isomorphic to the framework we just discussed before, because now the utility of the social panel is just going to average over each policymaker decision. So this is exactly isomorphic to the previous case. Yeah.
You just link this into an academic setting. So I have one RCT and I have several outcomes.
Yeah.
And I write up the effect of the RCT on health and send it to the JPE, and I write up the outcome on the application and I send it to the QJE.
Yeah.
And you would say there's the AEA that looks and says, oh, the JPE needs to correct for the stuff that's happening in the QJE paper.
In this case, yes, because there are cost complementarities. That's exactly right. Right, which kind of makes sense because otherwise we will start splitting up our papers as much as we can. And so the idea is that if there are cost complementarities, that's right.
And does it depend on whether it's the same purpose?
So that's a good question. So you're saying, what if? So okay, so suppose that we have two groups of authors, and now these two groups of authors are gonna each phase half of the cost. Now, in this case, the cost is going to be divided by half, and then these are two independent. I think. And I think it's going to be. I don't think it's going to depend if they are.
Okay, so
But let me think more. Yeah.
So if I write my paper on something that someone else has analyzed in the past, whatever there's rainfall shock.
Yeah.
There's 50 papers on rainfall shocks already on the effect of outcomes 1 to 50, and I look at the effect of rainfall shock on outcome 51.
Yeah.
And you would say I should correct for the first 50.
Right, unless there are some costs also writing up the paper. So if there are some costs for you that you face also to write the paper in the first place, then that's another story.
But it's sort of, you would say it doesn't depend on whether I wrote the first 50 papers or someone else wrote them, or whether I write them at the same time.
Whether the cost is complementary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It depends on the complementarity of the cost. So if, for example, if somebody writes one paper and then everybody can use that paper and submit it to different journals and submit the exact same paper with no cost, then yes, you should just use some hours to adjust it. That's the idea. Okay, so the other framework is where we have a single policymaker. So if we have a single policymaker, we can think that our decision function is going to be either 0 to 1, and the utility is going to be the probability of rejecting, so probability that r of x is equal to 1 minus the cost. And now suppose that our utility is going to take a weighted combination of this data, just to keep things simple, for some weights W star. Now, suppose that just each outcome is going to be assigned a different weight, it's going to have a different theta, and so the optimal thing to do in this case is just to do indexing, but the way you want to index the outcomes is just by the weights which characterize your welfare function. So this is a very simple point of the meeting. We are saying, well, if you care about multiple outcomes, then you should take a stand on what's your welfare function and just aggregate the outcome in the way you think this is important for welfare. And we think that this is a very simple point, but it can be useful. And so, for example, this recent paper in QJ is doing exactly this, motivated by this point, and also Give Directly, which is this NGO founded by Paul Nielsen and other people, is currently eliciting welfare weights from people participating in the experiment to think about how to aggregate outcomes. Exactly. So another way to think about this is to say, well, maybe each outcome is just a noisy measurement of the same underlying objective. So the expected value of each outcome is just the same. So if that's the case, then you just want to aggregate the outcome to minimize the variance. And this is again a very simple point that we're making, which connects to the idea that you want to do indexing if each outcome is just a noisy measurement of the same underlying objective. And so this kind of try to connect to this idea for which, or maybe I want to think about families of outcome if I think that within each family I'm just trying to capture the same latent effects, and then I want to think about aggregating outcomes with some welfare weights if instead I think that these are just aggregating into a given utility function, or I can even use a different function. Okay. In the last part, let me just touch on empirical studies. Although this is mostly a theoretical paper, we try to do some calibration just to see how things would look like. So for example, using clinical trial, we have some handle on variable cost and fixed cost. And we can basically recover how variable cost will change as a function of the number of subgroups and how fixed costs will behave. And so we can just think about having some adjustment which depend on a formula which is set depend on variable cost. And now this formula is going to have some components which multiplies times the size of testing one single hypothesis. This is going to be the size for testing capital J hypothesis. And so you can just look at different values of sizes that you would like to control for testing a single hypothesis, and then see how things behave as you increase the number of hypotheses, going from 1 to 3 to 4, etc., up to infinity. So for instance, 2.5% is what's prescribed by FDA for one hypothesis. So in this case, what this means is that if you test 9 hypotheses, you're going to have 0.9%. If you test infinite hypothesis, then things don't change that much. It's only going to become 0.7% and not 0, as family-wise already recommend.
Sorry, just again to make sure I understand some of the basic assumptions. The J here is not a choice variable, right? The J is given, but then you need to ensure participation for that given J.
Yeah. That's right.
So it's not like the researcher chooses the number of hypotheses. There is a fixed number of hypotheses. We need to make sure they run the experiment. And that gives us a lower bound.
That's right. Or it's fine if you think, so going back to the model, the last slide is going to be an extension. So in the model, there is an extension which we say the researcher ex ante can choose J and then just declare what's going to be J. But the researcher does not choose J based on the data.
But that, I mean, actually going back to our earlier discussion, that just kills the solution where I never reject. Right?
Sorry?
That just kills the solution where I never reject, because you have to have a lower bound on the utility of the researcher.
What do you mean kills the solution?
Like but if I had a testing rule that never rejects, the researcher would not run the experiment, and that's assumed away in your setting.
So okay, so you're saying, well, if we have a solution R of x is equal to 0, the utility of the researcher is always 0. So if the utility of the researcher is always 0, the researcher will always choose J equal to 0, for example. And so there's no experiment.
But that's the reason that drives the fact that you cannot have the solution. are equal to 0. Correct.
So the fact that we cannot have the solution R equal to 0 is because R equal to 0 can be one optimal solution if we don't care about the value of running an experiment. But if we do care about the value of running an experiment, then you basically want most powerful tests. So in the single hypothesis testing framework, then you like something that is not strictly lower than the upper bound of the cost of a profit, but something which is exactly equal to this upper bound where theta is equal to 0 and increasing in theta. Does this make sense?
I think I need to wrap my head around the pieces here.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk. I'm happy to talk more. Okay. What about broader applicability for research studies? So in principle, some of these comments may more broadly apply to policy experiments in economics. And here we're really thinking about application where there is an NGO which may collaborate closely with the researcher. And so Give Directly is one example, where Give Directly is this NGO providing cash transfer program to the poor. And so what we do is that we're going to look at the universe of experiments which have been founded by JPOL, this organization which found experiments mostly in developing countries, and so we're going to focus on experiments in low-income countries. Although I want to warn you that recently JPOL expanded their activities in North America as well. So there are some experiments in North America and there is heterogeneity, so I'm going to be clear in a minute. So a summary of the results by looking at this data to just see how financial costs change, taking financial costs just as a noisy proxy of total cost. Of course, that's not the case because there are time costs of the research and everything else, but at least it can give us some insight of our cost scale in economics. So first of all, there are some return to scale in the number of treatment times. So some multiple hypothesis testing adjustment seems to be needed, but Bonferroni is so stringent, there are no one-to-one. The cost is not invariant to the number of treatment rounds, but also there is some heterogeneity by context. So if we look at the experiment in low-income countries, these are going to have a very different shape from experiment in high-income country. Okay. So here is what I mean. If we just look at the main data, so this is more than 80% of the observation, we do see a positive relationship between the total proposed budget and the number of treatment times. But if instead we restrict our attention to the high-income countries, so this is just where JPOL has more recently started its activity, we do see a negative relationship, which at the beginning seems puzzling, but then if you have an experiment with 27 treatment times, then it might just well be that it's an Amazon entropy experiment with fixed costs much lower. So there is heterogeneity in the type of the experiment. So what we can do is that we can test the null hypothesis with multiple process correction to null hypothesis of whether beta is equal to 0 and beta is equal to 1, where beta is basically the coefficient of this log-log regression. So each test is going to provide us with information on whether there is basically some return to scale, which would require a Bonferroni type adjustment, or there's no return to scale, and so basically cost scale linearly in the number of treatment times. And so we can reject both hypotheses, which is kind of suggesting that some multiple hypothesis testing correction seems useful. You can even go on and look at the value of the coefficient and then suggest some type of adjustment which may depend on how we estimated the solution. Of course, with functional from assumption and so on, but at least provides some evidence of how cost scale in economics. So going back to some of the discussion we had throughout the talk, let me just say that we have lots of extensions in this paper. So one is the endogenous J. So J is going to be pre-specified by the researcher ex ante, and so this may depend on prior information about the value of parameters theta. We can think about the unknown theta or the researcher prior on theta, where we think about the researcher prior as having this signal about theta, and so welfare itself is going to be integrated over the signal itself, and then we're going to be max mean over the researcher prior. We can think about a setting where some of the researcher is benevolent, so some researcher have incentives which are aligned with the incentive of the researcher panel, and then we can be max mean optimal with respect to the proportion of the number of researchers there. Additional form of interaction, we discussed this. Alternative notional power, we discussed this. And we also think about a setting where maybe the variance can be heterogeneous and provide bounds on the distance between the proposed solution and the truly optimal solution. and also setting where basically you have a different weights on the importance of different hypotheses. And finally, we discussed two-sided tests. So this is actually a little bit tricky, typically, to motivate. And so to motivate two-sided tests in our framework, what we're going to do is that we're going to assume that if I don't report a significant result, then the policymaker may implement a policy at random, either implement a policy or doesn't implement a policy. So the fact that I tell you that the policy is going to be a negative effect with positive probability makes sure that the social plan will never implement the policy. And so this provides us with some way to motivate the two-sided test. So to conclude, we can think about multiple assessing in different frameworks. So one where we have multiple treatments, this connects to the idea that we want to motivate multiple assessing based on the type of hypothesis that we have. So with multiple treatments or multiple subgroups, the way research calls scale in the number of tests that we run is going to motivate different type of hypothesis assessing adjustment. But when we have multiple outcomes, things become very tricky, and it really depends on the way you want to model welfare. And so we can think of two ways in this paper. Of course, there can be more. So one is where you have an heterogeneous audience. And so in this case, you may want to do some multiple hypothesis assessing adjustment, maybe with indexing. And second, where you have an homogeneous audience, which you may want to do some indexing. And the way you want to do indexing depends on the utility function that you attach to each other. So that's pretty much it. And let me thank Max again for organizing this conference and everybody.
Thank you.